So thanks very much, everyone, for joining us. This is the last media briefing of 2021, and it is a reflection on all the major stories that have happened during the year. And we're joined by many of our journalists who work for us at the Religion Media Centre, and lots of guests as well. And it's very good to see your familiar faces on the call today. So thanks a lot for joining us. We've got various headlines to work through during this, and there's been a lot happening in 2021. And we're going to take it kind of topic by topic. And although we have guests to guide us through these things, if you want to pile in between and say something, do join us. It's going to be a bit like a house party at the end of the year. I know we've got Tim Wyatt and Mads Davis on the call. Hello, Mads from the Church Times. So I think we'll take this topic first because we know that you're there. And so, Tim, I'm going to hand over to you to introduce the first topic for the day and take it from here.
Thanks, Ruth. Hi, everyone. We're going to be chatting just for a few minutes about the Church of England, what's happened in the Church of England in the past 12 months and where does it go from here. I'm very pleased to be joined by Madeline Davies from the Church Times. I've actually forgotten, what is your current job title?
I'm senior writer.
Senior writer. It's great to have you here. The first topic I wanted to tackle on, which I think is probably fair to say the largest story in the church, is undoubtedly the kind of big row that is blowing up around church planting and the parish. You'll be obviously very familiar with this, but for people who haven't seen the story, kind of about 6 months or so ago, there was a large and ongoing row about Church of England's new plans to plant tens of thousands of new churches, particularly non-parish churches, fresh expressions and different forms of church. And this has provoked a massive backlash from a group calling itself Save the Parish, who see this as part of a threat to the kind of traditional English parish church. Mads, could you explain a little bit about why this blew up so much, why this is inflaming tensions quite so much?
Yes, so last year, the Archbishop of York launched something called Vision and Strategy, which is really the roadmap for the Church of England in the decade, the 2020s. And I think sort of as part of that, there was a strand called mixed ecology. So the idea behind that is that in order to reach more people, obviously we know the Church of England numerically is in decline. We would obviously still have our parish churches, but we would need other forms of church alongside that. So that would include fresh expressions, so different ways of reaching people. Then, as you say, over the summer, there was an announcement at a conference by a church planting organisation that there was an aim to plant 10,000 churches led by lay people rather than clergy over the decade. So I guess sort of the concern is that is this going to undermine what many see as the sort of traditional bedrock of the Church of England, the parish? So there's been a lot of reassurance from the centre that that's not the intention and that the parish will remain the heart of the Church of England. But at the same time, as I say, with the decline of numbers, the strategy is very clear that we will need other approaches in order to attract more people.
Is this another kind of front in the ongoing kind of tradition war within the Church of England, where you have the kind of low church evangelicals on one side versus the high church traditionalists, or does it cut across those kind of churchmanship boundaries?
So I think the Save the Parish campaign, which you've mentioned, was a campaign to elect people onto General Synod who would defend the parish and would campaign for more resources for parish churches. And I know they would argue that actually people who stood on that platform come from across traditions. So they would say that people of all traditions are concerned about the future of the parish. I think for context, the decline in Church of England attendance and cuts to the number of paid clergy that we have is a kind of decades-long phenomenon. So although this has recently got a lot of attention, particularly in the broadsheets, this isn't in a sense a new thing. We've had financial problems and cuts to clergy for a very long time now.
You mentioned that Save the Parish had a kind of campaign to get candidates under that banner elected onto the General Synod, which had its first meeting just last month. They claim that they were very successful and they've got a large cohort on the Synod. Are we likely to see that faction, that party, actually try and frustrate some of these changes that are coming from the bishops? Or do they actually have the power to do that at Synod?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the difficulties is that actually, although we can have a national vision, dioceses are quite independent. So the Church of England is split up into 42 dioceses, sort of regionally, and they will very much make their own decisions about how resources are invested, about numbers of clergy. So although the National General Synod is a place where you can have influence, I would say that a lot of the levers that you would need to pull to change direction are actually more at a regional level. So you'd actually want to influence at that level in order to sort of counter some of the direction, if that's what you wanted to do.
And just briefly then, do you think if this kind of plans do go ahead, will it eventually kind of overturn the Church of England as we know it? Are we going to end up having kind of parallel systems of a parish church plus an equal number of these kind of new types of church? Or is it really going to be more like the same kind of muddling through and tinkering that we've seen in recent years?
I mean, I think sometimes there's this sort of binary between you've got your parish church and your fresh expression, but in reality, a lot of these sort of new forms of church or new forms of outreach actually come out of parish churches. So if you look at a diocesan level, where some of these new initiatives, new worshipping communities are coming from, they're coming out of parish churches. So I think possibly sort of on the ground, there's a lot more sort of collaboration and synergy than might be represented in some of the debates.
Isn't this really an argument about money, Matt? You know, who gets it? Who is to pay for all these churches with non-self-sustaining congregations?
Yeah, so when I was making notes for the debate, I was noting that I think it was predicted that the Church of England would see a fall in income of 10% this year. And actually, many dioceses already had a structural deficit even before COVID hit. So there was there's a financial question that's completely set aside from the impact of the pandemic, that dioceses are struggling to pay for full-time clergy, which many people see as synonymous with the parish model. You know, they want their own vicar for their church, and many dioceses are saying that may not be possible, particularly given sort of relatively low levels of giving in the Church of England.
Yeah, when I was looking at this last year, I found, I think, one diocese out of 42 that wasn't running at a deficit, and that was before the pandemic. These were pre-pandemic figures. So is there actually any realistic chance that the Save Our Parish movement will succeed in what it wants to do?
So I think the message from Save the Parish is that, we know that the church commissioners are sitting on more than £9 billion investment fund, and they would say that we need to be using more of that money to subsidise parish ministry. And I think there's been mixed messages on that front. They've definitely been challenged at General Synod about whether they could do that. I know they did release some funds to sort of tide people over during COVID, and some people are saying, that needs to become more permanent. They're going to have to use more of the national sort of windfalls from investments to subsidise more parish ministry.
Madeline, alongside Save Our Parish, should there be another movement? Get rid of some of our dioceses? 42. It's just remarkable. And goodness knows how many people they employ. The cost must be enormous.
Well, I was talking to the Bishop of Leeds recently because we did have a bringing together of dioceses in West Yorkshire, and it became the Diocese of Leeds. I don't think it was actually demonstrated that did save very much money, actually, but he was saying really we never really drilled down into what we learned from that. If we are going to call for more such, I know he doesn't like the word merger, other people use it, but if we are going to repeat that, we really need to evaluate whether it worked in West Yorkshire and Leeds, because we've never really sort of studied in detail what the impact of that was.
It would be interesting to know how many people are employed, and And do the diocese, well, the parishes are complaining about parish share, do the diocese keep employing more and more people?
I mean, some of the dioceses have cuts. I know in Norwich they cut 10% of staff, so it's not that cuts are only falling at parish level, they are cutting diocesan staff as well. I mean, some things I think it will be very hard to cut. I know another theme of the year has obviously been safeguarding, and there's been an enormous expansion in what we spend on safeguarding. I think it'd be very hard to cut something like that. But that's definitely been a pushback at parish level, is to say, you know, should some of these cuts not be coming from the central office as they would see it?
Well, Mads, thanks ever such a lot for your contribution there. Do stay with us and chip in as we go. I wonder if we can move to COVID, which is obviously very much with us still at the moment, and just reflect on the impact that's had on the religious life of the UK and well and around the world. We are expecting Bob Smashiana from the Religion News Service, but I can't see him yet. But we do have Peter Phillips. Hi, Peter. Without your usual Technicolor background, to say.
Hello, how are you?
Grayscale now. Nice to see you again. Can I ask you to just introduce this for us with the DATs and the data and the facts and the stats? What's the picture that is emerging of how COVID-19 has impacted religious organisations in the UK this year?
Yeah, I think it's very, very mixed, isn't it? Because you've had the BRIC 19 survey out now, which kind of demonstrated that people weren't overly keen on how things went during the lockdown. The survey was kind of heavily weighted towards more elderly parishioners, and it was a kind of self-invited survey rather than a kind of opinion poll and so on. You tie that in then with what's happened with attendance numbers, where attendance numbers seem to be down to about a third of what they were pre-COVID for those who are coming back on site, with another third online, and perhaps a third who seem to have, seem to be kind of given up the habit, as it were, during the lockdown. That's not the same with all denominations. The Baptists are doing very, very well at the moment, in coming back very strongly. And that may be something about their ecclesiology or their understanding of what the church is, with a kind of very corporate sense of church engagement, rather than church being as much about a kind of physical building or theatre. But we'll have to kind of see how things are going. I think that one of the core things we've learned is that that clergy are human, really, really tired. There's lots and lots of clergy who've been trying to do both online and on site at the same time, and so kind of maximize their time, spread themselves out. But after 18 months of doing that, you simply end up, you hit the buffers. And so more and more now, we've got tired out clergy who are now trying to go back into online during the Omicron wave, and finding that they just have nothing left in the tank, as it were.
What about spirituality? What does the data tell us about whether people are praying more?
Yeah, I mean, so discipleship is the key winner from the lockdown. More and more people are engaging in online prayer or online engagement with the Bible or spirituality forums and so on. Durham celebrated its huge new College of Prayer the other day. And we've seen this across morning prayer and so on across the churches, that people tend to, whereas before you'd have a vicar kind of turning up with one or two people in the parish church for morning prayer, you now get lots and lots of people coming in for morning prayer online. And you see this in minsters, in parish churches, in cathedrals and so on. Durham's perhaps the biggest and has had the resources to create this 4,500 international College of Prayer, which is just huge. And I think it would be interesting to hear about other religions as well, in that kind of we've always kind of thought, well, Islam and in Judaism, because it's centered upon the home and the family and the community, rather than a building as such, then discipleship and spirituality have continued to be home-centered. And that's been really, really important for their engagement with what's going on. And to some extent, it's the building-based religions which have really been hit hardest by this.
I think the case of mosques is actually quite interesting when it comes to COVID, especially in comparison, I think, to the experience of the Christian church more generally. I think one of the interesting things that emerged was there was a general feeling, I think, amongst certainly amongst the Christian community, but also the Jewish community, that the digital turn in the early stages of COVID was generally positive for attendance and engagement with the religion. Certainly not for attendance, but physical attendance, but good for otherwise reaching people who otherwise might not go to a place of worship. But that really wasn't the case for mosques. Many mosques did engage digitally, did start broadcasting services, but they were really playing catch up. And I think this is a demographic issue for Muslims in the UK, because quite a few, well, even just over half of the Muslim population in the UK are under the age of 30 and British born. And so they're kind of digital natives. And there are already kind of services and provisions online that they're accessing for that digital connection. So they turn back to that rather than the mosque. So the mosques were really playing catch up, and there wasn't really, I think, much of a benefit for many mosques in going digital. Since August, the numbers have actually recovered. And I think that also shows that there was a provision, there was something within the physical space of the mosque that worshippers were looking for that isn't really met with online spaces or online worship otherwise. But I think one of the most interesting things that come out of the pandemic for mosques is the kind of institutional development and the accelerated institutional development. So the Muslim Council of Britain did a reasonably robust piece of research on councils of mosques. So more regionalized, localized groups and initiatives, which were seeking to coordinate the activities of mosques, which are otherwise quite congregationalist and quite independent. And this has really been kind of ushered on by the pandemic, because there needed to be this coordination. And I think the other kind of dynamic to this is that it's also formalized some of the engagement between regional administrations or devolved governments and groups of worship. So you've really seen the difference, and it's been very, very clear the difference in approach between, say, the Welsh, Scottish, and Northern Irish governments and the mosques and Muslim communities, and that of Westminster. And that's really been, I think, highlighted over the last few years. So I think coming forward, I think the question is really for mosques is, how long the impact of that kind of year and a half of interrupted attendance and finances will be, because they have recovered now, but in terms of attendance, but whether the long-term impact on finances will be an issue.
Mm.
I think one of the things that Azim was saying that was really interesting about young people. Barna brought out research about hybrid church during the lockdown in the States. And they found that, Tim Hutchings did this big research on creating churches online a while ago, and argued very strongly that online church was supplemental to on-site church. So engagement in religion tended to be physical, and then, in person in church and buildings. And then people might do online as a supplement, as an add-on kind of thing. Barna found that actually digital millennials and Gen Z are now more likely to go online for their religious expression and to connect with their religious community. And it's no longer supplemental. And even for baby boomers and Gen X and what have you, it was still in the high 40s. And so we do see that switch now, that online becomes much more central to the religious, spiritual expression of younger people, but actually all ages as well. And we'll see how that goes. I don't think we should kind of raving about metaverse and the church being in the metaverse and what have you. I think the metaverse is a kind of dead cat bounce for Zuckerberg. But there is this sense now. How do we express ourselves? How do we express ourselves religiously online, spiritually online? How do we engage that is going to be kind of one of the things that we need to look at into the future.
Can I just bring in Catherine Pepinster at this point for the implications of COVID for the place of faith groups in society, and the government clocking the fact that the faith groups have contacts that go right down to the grassroots in a way that perhaps other agencies don't, and what that means for the future relations between faith groups and the government. Catherine, I don't know if you've got any observations on that this year.
Yes, I think the pandemic has highlighted the grassroots strengths of different faith groups. something that those of us involved with faith organisations knew were there, but maybe other people didn't. I think there's been some really remarkable work, including faith groups working together. You'll remember when the first lockdowns came in, and there were efforts to get homeless people off the streets into hotels, Premier Inns, etc., travel lodges, and they still needed meals, and a lot of faith organisations worked to get together to provide those. There were also some homeless people who had been on the street a long time and felt uneasy about being indoors, and they also needed food assistance, etc. Again, churches, other faith organisations stepped in and worked, because they already had the structure. They already knew what to do because they work in this field already. I mean, it even was interesting to see that local authorities such as Westminster City Council, it didn't occur to them that if you close all the public toilets in London because there's a lockdown, it means that homeless people haven't got anywhere to go to the loo. And it was the churches who said to the local authority, look, they've got to stay open, and they got them back open. The report that the National Churches Trust brought out a short while ago, called House of Good, highlighted the amount of work that Christian churches do in the community at all times, and I'm sure that's replicated through mosques, gurdwaras, etc. But this work became even more crucial during the pandemic, and I think that the government has clocked this. In the last 20 odd years, I think governments, starting with Blair and Brown, and then David Cameron with his Big Society Ideas, they recognised that faith groups have a role to play in society, but it really has been highlighted by the pandemic. And I imagine that if we are going to see cuts in services because of how much government spent elsewhere, the faith groups are going to become even more important in this area.
We were expecting, weren't we, at the end of this year, that we may have a government faith department set up. That would be the outcome of the Colin Bloom report, but nothing's happened on that. I don't know if anyone's got any intelligence on that. Catherine, have you heard anything?
No, and we also had the Danny Kruger initiative too, didn't we? He was supposed to be having a look at this field, but it seems to be something that the government is dependent upon, but isn't setting up anything particularly official, but others might have different views.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I wonder if we can just shift a gear as well. And we've got lots of people on the call. You've all got your highlights of this year, so you'll all get the chance. I'm just wading through this list of stories. Can I just go to Azim, back to Azim? Azim, you are actually writing a chapter on what's happened in the Muslim communities in the UK for a book this year. So you're well placed and highly researched to give us your highlights, headlines of the stories that have hit your faith this year in the UK.
So yeah, it's a chapter for the yearbook of Muslims in Europe, and I'm doing the chapter on the UK, and it does provide a very reasonable summary of the kind of key stories. So I've been kind of wading through them and going back through the archives as well. So I think some of the kind of key highlights, and it was always difficult to assess, which stories were just covered a lot and which stories were really impactful within the communities, even from within the community itself. But I think the kind of year started with a bit of a bang with the election of Zara Mohammed as the Secretary General of the Muslim Council of Britain. I think the Muslim Council of Britain electing quite a young woman was kind of taken as newsworthy by a few outlets, and there was a fair amount of coverage. And I think kind of associated with that was also, I suppose if you're familiar with it, is a now infamous interview with Emma Barnett on Women's Hour, and a debate on women imams. So there was quite a few news stories right at the beginning of the year that felt very interesting, because they were looking at kind of internal Muslim politics, authority, administration, and these aren't very often issues which are covered when it comes to religion media and Muslims, which does sometimes tend towards the more kind of sensationalist stories. This being a much more kind of mundane issue of the representation, authority, changes in demography was actually quite interesting to see covered, and I think quite welcome. And kind of associated with that, again, sort of a few months later, Zara met with a minister from, it wasn't a minister, I can't remember exact title, but someone who was within the cabinet of Westminster government. And there's been a bit of a decade-long unofficial kind of cold stonewalling of the Muslim Council of Britain, and this was perhaps an accidental breach of that. But I think there's been questions, especially with the pandemic, about how far Westminster government is meaningfully engaging with the Muslim community, and this kind of highlighted that aspect of it. Going forward, then I think more towards the end of the year, the racism at the Yorkshire County Cricket Club and Azim's kind of testimony of it was certainly something that dominated both the headlines, but also the issue of racism and racism in sport for Muslims. And I think those kind of bookended the year altogether. In between, there's quite a few other stories. Some of the more interesting ones definitely came from kind of more localized spaces. So I myself am based in Wales, in Cardiff, and there was the death of a young black man, a Muslim, of Somali heritage in custody. That was something that elicited very strong reactions. There were protests, and it kind of brought up the question of institutional Islamophobia as well as racism, especially because in Cardiff, there is this long history of the policing and securitization of Muslim communities. One of the last individuals to be hanged for a crime in the UK was a Somali man from Cardiff. And also then you have a very famous case, a mistrial from the 90s involving men from the same area of Cardiff Buttown, which is in the public consciousness. And I think there are quite a few stories like this, ones which were somewhat localized, but had a big impact within those communities. A nice little positive blip in the sort of quite dismal kind of news stories around COVID and the kind of crisis around COVID was a news clip of some madrasa students in a Dar al-Ulum, a seminary in the north of England, celebrating an England goal during the Euro 2020 competition, which was held in 2021 for some reason. And I think that was, again, sort of interesting because much like with Zara Mohammed, I think there's this increasing public consciousness of a shift in demographics and a shift in the sort of composition of the Muslim community in the UK. And while for those who are familiar with madrasa and young Muslims, they would know that, supporting England in the, international football competitions is pretty mundane. It also, I think, highlighted this kind of combination and cross-fertilization of cultures, which I think is gaining increasing awareness. And as a final few stories, just to throw up, Anas Sarwar in Scotland was elected head of the Labour Party in Scotland. That's quite a big first. For many Muslims, the official end of the Quilliam Foundation was something that many people noted. So this was a foundation which produced reports often on terrorism and extremism and was led by Majid Nawaz. And it was quite infamous and quite debated, but it was officially closed down and wound up in this year. And there were a few deaths as well, just of note. Meryl Wynne Davis, a very well-known prolific writer, Muslim convert, as well as Abdul Qadir Sufi, who was another convert who established a community in Norfolk, a mosque in Norfolk. But these are both Muslims who had an international reputation within the wider Muslim community, though I think quite maybe below the radar of public consciousness, but they both passed away this year.
Thank you. Wow, it's a whistle-stop tour. Thank you very much indeed.
Ruth, could I just ask Azim something? I completely missed the closure of Quilliam. What was the wider story on that?
Well, I think we just announced in a tweet, as things are these days. That's where you get your news from. And I think a lot of it had to do with Majid Nawaz increasing association with conspiracy theories and American conspiracy theories, that sort of Trump angle of the insurgency and a stolen election. And I think his strong association with those sort of conspiracy theories, I think had, the standing kind of statements are that it kind of made the funders of Quilliam nervous to the extent that they just wasn't able to run anymore. And a lot of his colleagues as well, I think, had stepped away from association with Quilliam because of that. I think that's my guess of kind of what happened, but it was just announced with a closure and not much more information about the exact reasons.
Is there any sense that they've been pushed out by governments as well?
It's a good question. I don't think so necessarily, because I don't think there was much. I think the activities of kind of Quilliam and other think tanks still get the traction they need when they issue a report or are able to sort of publish findings on an issue. But I think you're probably right in the sense that they at one point they, I think, had a pride of place with the government. I don't think that was the case in the last 5 years or so.
It's interesting. Thank you.
Thank you both. Now I know that Andrew, you've got to go quite soon, and we have Jonathan remain on the line as well. But Andrew, when we were going through just discussing the stories from this year, and you said that you felt that the story about assisted suicide was a very important story to come out of 2021. Can you just tell us a bit more about why you feel that's one of the most important stories to feature in the year?
Well, I think it's a mixture of what Linda Woodhead calls Rihanna morality, where it is all about being your best self, and there is a great deal of sort of liberal pushing for this. Why should people be kept alive when they don't want to be? Coupled, and here I part company with most of the people who are in favour of it, with economic pressures. So you can see a slow, definite shift of opinion in favour of assisted suicide. There's a sort of hardcore of campaigners, and then there's beyond the people who are campaigning for it all the time. There is a general shift of opinion, I think, among opinion-forming classes. I remember when people can't really see the objection. And I'm really interested in Jonathan Romain's take on this, because he's active in all this.
Yeah, well, there's certainly a change in the climate, and whereas from a religious point of view, we have the thou shalt not coming from really all the religious hierarchies, and silencing any dissent from below the ranks of the chief rabbi, the Archbishop of Canterbury, or the Cardinal of Westminster. I think what's happened is the debate has opened up much more widely. In fact, there's now a religious alliance for assisted dying, for people who are saying, well, actually, there is a case. Now, of course, people are entitled to disagree with it, but there is a religious case for people being allowed to let go. And which is why we don't use the word suicide, because suicide has the connotations of that if you didn't commit suicide because of your situation, then you might well have lived on for another 20 or 30 years. Whereas assisted dying is for people who are dying already, whether it's weeks or months. And therefore, it's just a matter of, in religious terms, saying to God, thank you very much. It's been a great life so far, but I'd gently like to hand it back, because the only thing that lies ahead is suffering. And it's also, I suppose, to do with to what extent you give individuals autonomy. To what extent could I say to you, no, I'm sorry, you've got to suffer on? Or do I say, no, it's your life, you have the ability to let go? And it seems to me, and many others, that it's more religious, more kind, more humane to give that people freedom if they so wish, but with a very important proviso of safeguards to make sure that people who are perhaps in a vulnerable situation are not misled or bullied or anything like that. No, just to finish off, and the climate is changing. Andrew's totally right. And of course, we've had now votes in Jersey. There's going to be a bill in Scotland. There was a very positive debate in the House of Lords where the opposition withdrew their amendment. So it feels like it's not immediate, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was in the next decade that it does become law.
I mean, my impression is that all the proposed safeguards are either too narrow to have any real effect, or so wide that they would cut off everything. The proposal most recently that 2 doctors should sign off on this. Look at the state of the NHS. Do you think doctors have time to do the sort of proper appraisal that would be needed for that kind of thing? How do you decide?
I think I would be more worried if it wasn't for Oregon. Now, you have to bear in mind, of course, as people here will know, that there are different types of a suicide. And for instance, in Belgium, they have much, much more liberal, permissive laws. But in Oregon, which has been going for 25 years, the law is virtually the same as in Britain. And we've seen what happens. And therefore, it's one of those situations where we can be fairly confident about, well, this has been the pattern for the last quarter of a century in the USA, and it will probably be the same if this law is passed in England, whereby a number of people, of course, do get the official permission, but don't take it up because they want to have that emotional safety net of knowing that if things go horribly pear-shaped, yes, they can opt for it. But actually, most people, their life force says that they actually carry on to their dying breath.
Thank you both. I'm sorry because I know we should be having a longer discussion. We did have one earlier in the year, and I'm sure we'll return to it. But thank you very much for joining the discussion, Jonathan, and thanks, Andrew. So now I would like to turn to Christopher Lamb. When we were thinking of all the stories about the Roman Catholic Church this year, there's about 5 or 6 of them, and Christopher, you're joined by several eminent pundits to go through this. We've got John McManus, formerly with the BBC and now with Jesuits UK. It's great to see you in your new role, John, there.
Thank you.
and Catherine Pepinster and Christopher Jameson. Hello, Christopher. I haven't seen you for a while. So do join in. Christopher, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thanks, Ruth. And there are obviously a lot of stories to cover. We've had Pope Francis really ratcheting up his reforms with the synod process, which is underway across the church and is being responded to in various ways. We've had Francis back on the road. He made an historic trip to Iraq in March. He also was in Greece and Cyprus at the beginning of this month and raising the issue of the migrants crisis. Again, we've also had the unprecedented Vatican corruption trial ongoing, and which is still happening, which involves for the first time a senior cardinal who has been accused of financial mismanagement. And again, this is a sign of the reforms that Pope Francis is trying to bring about. And I think we've also had a sense from the Pope that he's not going to hang around, he's not going to hold back when it comes to trying to implement the reforms of the Second Vatican Council. And we saw that with some of the restrictions that he's put around the traditional Latin Mass. But perhaps before we discuss any of those, I think we need to focus on probably the biggest or one of the most impactful Catholic stories of the year, which is Boris Johnson getting married in Westminster Cathedral and revealing himself as the first Catholic Prime Minister that Britain has had since the Reformation. So, I mean, Catherine, that was quite a surprise, wasn't it?
Yes, I think people were flabbergasted. I got a phone call about it on the Saturday saying Boris got married in Westminster Cathedral, and I was completely taken aback. Shouldn't have been, because I think it was not long before that they'd had baby Wilfred baptized. It's never been entirely clear whether his wife is Catholic or not. Now they're saying she is. I'm not sure if she's a convert. I worked at the Independent. People knew her father very well, and they thought there was no, when her mother worked there too, no knowledge that this was a Catholic family. So who knows? No doubt we should all rejoice that Boris has rediscovered his Catholic roots. But I know a lot of people felt this doesn't show the Catholic Church in a good light, because Boris has a certain reputation, and despite previous marriages, he could walk back in. But this is the stuff of canon law, of course, that those previous marriages weren't viewed as valid. So he's entirely free to get married. But God works in mysterious ways, and here we have a prime minister who refound God through what some people might call adultery. So it has entertained us all, though it has also caused some Catholics a great deal of annoyance, those who've tried to get their marriages annulled and be able to marry in the Catholic Church again.
Yeah, there were lots of people who felt that this was unfair because they'd had been unable to remarry in the church. Now, of course, canon law does allow for Boris to have been married in accordance with the rules. But I suppose
his commitment to his faith seems to be growing. He noticeably did not bother to go to mass during G8. Was it G8 or G7 in Cornwall?
G7.
Whereas President Biden
did.
Went along to the local parish in St Ives. Boris wasn't there, but at David Amos's funeral, up popped Boris to receive communion in the cathedral at the altar where he was married. So
I wonder though,
this is growing in profundity for him.
Yeah, but I wonder if there, at a serious level, is a bit of a problem with the Catholic Church being so associated with Boris, giving him this kind of green pass to be married in the cathedral. And given what's been going on recently, given that there are accusations that Boris is unable to tell the truth, should the Catholic Church, or should some of the other churches, be saying something about what's been going on? I mean, it is remarkable that there's been a silence from the churches over the latest Partygate rows, etc. I know that some Church of England bishops spoke out when Dominic Cummings was found to have gone to Barnard Castle, and they were then criticised for doing so. But should the Catholic Church be saying something about the moral credibility of this government?
Can I just jump in there? I suspect that a reason why the churches struggle to jump in and make moral claims is that they feel that they're on very thin ice themselves. The leadership are on thin ice themselves.
And I think that is quite a significant shift. And I presume you're saying that because of the failures to handle abuse and the abuse crisis, Andrew. And I mean, we maybe in the past we would have seen a church leader speak out about what's been going on.
I do think they have an anxiety about being seen as finger wagging, and certainly with the Catholic Church, you see a certain reticence nowadays about some issues, and sometimes they like certain members of the laity to speak up about particular issues in the public domain more than certain clerics. I think they think that people view the Catholic Church as sort of tainted goods, that people dismiss what they've got to say. They don't want them moralizing. They're not. I don't think that they even step up and speak that much more about assisted dying. They seem to spot doctors who have experience in something like hospice care, and they'd rather those speak.
But if there is,
it's interesting that role in the public domain isn't there. If you think back to Cardinal Basil Hume, who seemed to be forever on the Today programme, being interviewed by Sue McGregor. I mean, Cardinal Vincent Nichols is an absentee from the airwaves, really.
Can I just jump in there, Catherine? I mean, looking at it from my point of view as a former journalist, I think actually the Catholic Church in particular is quite right to stay out of any kind of moralising about politicians' lives or their personal trustworthiness. And just going back to what you were saying, Christopher, about Johnson's marriage at Westminster Cathedral, I imagine quite a lot of political opponents throughout the country, political opponents of Johnson, would have loved to have imagined the idea that just before he got married, a priest gave Johnson a finger-wagging lecture on his personal morals and his public morals as well. But once the church starts going into that, then it's harming their ability to talk to government about wider issues like the migrant crisis, or people living in poverty, or COVID restrictions on churches. Because once you start once you start jumping on Johnson, but not on other politicians, for example, because there's always a bit of whataboutery. Once you start doing that, doesn't the church destroy its own credibility in being able to reach into government to talk about much bigger, more important issues?
I'm not sure how much they do that either. That's the issue, really. When I said that Vincent Nichols doesn't pop up on the Today programme in the way that Cardinal Hume did, I wasn't suggesting he should pop up to talk about Boris Johnson's family arrangements, but more something like the refugee crisis. They do speak out, but I'm not sure how well connected our bishops are with government either. I'm not sure if their connections are particularly strong. They're not particularly strong compared, for example, to evangelicals who've got some very strong roots in the
I think there was quite a lot over the COVID. There was quite a lot of dialogue there at that time.
Well, there was on the specifics of what we're going to do about worship. Yes,
but talking about credible moral leadership, I mean, Pope Francis has been arguably one of the leading voices on the world stage when it comes to advocating for migrants and highlighting the plight of refugees, something he did whilst in Greece and Cyprus. John, I know that you, with the Jesuits, will be very involved in this issue. Perhaps you could tell us a bit about where you see this in terms of the church. Is this something that the church leadership and the church generally could do more of in terms of showing that the church is on the side of refugees and migrants?
Yeah, I mean, the wider church, I mean, and I'm thinking now specifically about the Pope, I mean, his comments, even just the last few days when he was in Cyprus and in Lesbos were really, really strong. I mean, I think at one point he said to refugees, for those in Europe who are scared of you, they clearly never looked in your eyes. And that was a really powerful line. And of course, he has that showbiz quality to get those messages around the world. And as you know, Christopher, the media love him. They hang on every word he says. And because of that, and because he has a lot of credibility with also non-Christians and non-Catholics, he's really able to make the running in the way that, for example, bishops and archbishops in Britain often find so very, very difficult. And I think certainly for the church in Britain, from what I can see, they concentrate their resources on doing the practical, on the ground kind of work that helps people's lives. So the Jesuit Refugee Service, for example, is very involved in working with those who are stuck in immigration removal centres, as they're now called, those people who've lost their asylum appeals and are now just waiting to be deported. So they provide them with practical and spiritual and emotional help as well. Whereas I think certainly for Pope Francis, his roots, his message is the one that he's able to elaborate on so successfully, and which does make the world sit up and take notice. I think he's spoken about the problems on the Belarusian and Polish border. I think he has. I'm not absolutely 100% sure. I'd like to see more focus there. And I'd like to hear more from the local churches in those countries as well, which I haven't heard that much from, but maybe the British media is not picking up on that.
Yes.
But I mean, speaking of refugees, and I think kind of moral leadership, I think one of the areas where I felt the more established religious leadership could be more vocal is, and it brings us to, towards the end of the year, is the Borders and Nationality Bill. So this is a piece of law which effectively makes anyone capable of having any other passport or national citizenship be at risk of having their British nationality or citizenship stripped without much in terms of due process. This particular form of punishment has been used exceptionally up to now, and up until I think Theresa May's government, it was almost exclusively used against individuals who are involved in explicit treason, so working with the Russians during the Cold War, that kind of case. And then increasingly it was used for individuals associated with terrorism or extremism. For example, Shima Begum is the most famous case, but there are about a dozen others, all of Muslim background. And this bill kind of goes further because it's allowing and kind of cementing the use of stripping citizenship as a punitive measure or as a measure to deal with refugees and migrants. And it's something that does really disproportionately, I think, affect a minority population, but I think also speaks to what I would hope is the wider concerns of faith groups around kind of the value of the human being, their belongings, their rights, their inalienable rights, their sacredness as an individual. And it is really, I think, one of the more concerning cases that's come out over the last year. And I think frustratingly, it's been overshadowed by a Christmas party. Not to say that that wasn't an important story, but certainly, the nationality bill has been something I think very concerning. And certainly those from a Muslim background, I can see, Jazz, you're also nodding. For those from a, South Asian or migrant background, our parents often had kind of backup plans, money saved up and suitcases ready in case things ever go sour. And I always felt a bit sort of maybe, pessimistic, but, these kind of movements do feel deeply uncomfortable.
Can I just say, just building on your points and about what Peter Phillips has said, he's saying that, is the church too wrapped up in its own problems and not able to critique government on, say, migrants and refugees or on climate change, and that's obviously a massive issue this year. If I could just ask the panel who are looking at the Catholic issues, and maybe Christopher Jamison could say something about this synodal process that the Catholic Church has undertaken, which is a massive reform effort that I think is designed to try and make the Church less self-referential and more outward looking. How is that process going from your perspective?
Well, I think what's really interesting is that the Church of England's default setting, of course, is it wants to be the church for the nation. And I think that's why it's got this panic on about preserving its parishes and 10,000 new planted churches and so on. The Catholic Church, I think, in this country, has less of a concern about that. And indeed, globally, it's more concerned to be the church of the people rather than the church of the nation, if I can make that fine distinction. And what we're seeing in Pope Francis is a person who in Latin America lived this out personally at a very profound level. And I think what we're seeing is the Latin Americanization of the Catholic Church globally. I think this explains why the North American Catholic Church is completely bemused by this process, and why the European Church is also struggling to understand it. I think lay people are stepping up very strongly to embrace this model. I think they feel a very direct connection to Pope Francis and what he's trying to do. And I think we're seeing the beginnings of a shift, which in England, I think will have to include not becoming big statements about the big problems, but rather a more coordinated approach to local expressions of engagement with these big problems at the local level, migrants being the classic example. And I think Jesuit Refugee Service already does important work in that regard. So I think there is a serious shift going on, which has yet to play out, but I'm quite hopeful that with the engagement of lay people, there will be a significant shift in the Catholic Church globally and, God willing, locally in this country as well. But it's very early days.
So watch this space.
Just one really interesting thing that Christopher just said there, and the local integration of the churches and faiths and so on, I think is really important as we build effective alliances in local communities, because that's where rubber hits the road, as it were.
Yeah.
And if the church, if the churches and the faiths are so wrapped up in kind of institutional shifting and moving the deck chairs, as it were, it's only in the local place that there's going to be an effective alliance that can be built up. That happens around climate change, that happens around the Borders Bill and so on. It will happen as well about voting and civil liberties as well as we move through, I think. But it'll be interesting to see whether that, the kind of thing that happened in Burnley, the kind of thing that happened in London and so on, will that be developed in other communities as well?
I think one of the difficulties of this, if the synod set up, and I don't know how to solve this, but I think the Catholic Church should be thinking about this, is that it's hearing from people who are still in the Catholic Church. But what about the people who've moved away from it? The people who've lapsed, the people who've gone because they're so unhappy about the way women are treated in the Catholic Church, or they've been so profoundly distraught by the abuse crisis. How do they hear from them? How are they going to take into consideration those people who perhaps feel lost because they haven't replaced the church with something else, but but aren't part of it anymore. I found it very noticeable when I was involved in some synodal discussions in my own parish, where we were invited to talk, that the people who were conversing seemed to be either Catholics who think the church can do no wrong and that everything's absolutely marvelous and don't want change, and then people who seem to be hanging on from their fingertips. But it just felt that there's a sort of another group of people who are somehow missing, and I don't know how they're going to hear from them or think about what they might feel, but I think it's really important.
I think our first Zoom of the next year, Catherine, is going to be looking ahead to 2022. So remember that thought, and be Tuesday, January the 4th, everybody. Well, thank you for that. Well, there's a lot going on that agenda. Just picking up though what you were saying about climate change and bringing in Jen Morris from the Young Christian Climate Network. You were a guest on one of our earlier Zooms this year, Jen, on COP26, and Jasjit, if you're still there as well. Jen, can I just turn to you first of all and ask for your highlights from 2021 as you look back on it? Whether you feel that the faith groups who were all present in Glasgow and the campaigns leading up, big campaigns leading up to the actual event, whether you feel they cut through looking back on it?
Yeah, I think certainly the faith campaigns were one of the highlights of COP26, one of the few highlights, unfortunately. And I think it's interesting to see how the climate crisis issue plays into all these things that everybody else has been discussing in terms of COVID and vaccine inequality. We saw that 40% of delegates couldn't even come to COP because of the vaccine rules and isolation and all these things. The same with the Nationality and Borders bill is only going to make it more illegal, more difficult for climate refugees to find safe places. And yet this is a problem that we're causing. So it's interesting to see how everything we've discussed today basically ties into that injustice. But yeah, I think one of the highlights was how the faith groups came together. We had multiple interfaith events during COP, and they, for me certainly, and for lots of other people in YCCN, were really powerful and moving. It was one of the few things that gave us hope was how much we had that community that did really passionately care about this and was speaking out, was acting, was campaigning and all in very different ways. The extent to which it cut through, I think, is harder to gauge. Like, we had a lot of good media engagement and it did get out there, but as I say, COP26 was incredibly disappointing. So from the point of view of, did it make a difference? I think that's harder to tell. And we're kind of having the sort of discussions and thoughts in our own group as to whether we keep going sort of directly through politics, or if we try and subvert and say that clearly they're not moving, they're not doing anything, we just have to just get on with something we can do ourselves.
Whether you feel, looking back on it, there were things that religious organisations could have done differently to have made more of an impact?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think maybe sort of streamlining our message a bit more. I mean, we had this sort of broad brush thing on climate justice, which is obviously what we were all pushing for, but that doesn't mean a lot to a lot of the population, actually. So we tried to go down some specific roads on the asks in terms of climate finance, but there were people pushing in other directions, and that's tricky because we all have different things that like at the top of close to our hearts, and the problem is it's such a big topic that like streamlining that message is difficult. But I think that's possibly something that we could do moving forward is get our messaging in line in order to get right into the politics, because they don't listen for very long, and so you have to maximize the impact for the 10 minutes that they do listen to us.
Well, thank you for coming back to us at the end of the year as well, Jen. And once more, you're invited on January the 4th when we look ahead to 2022. Andrew, I know you've chipped in from time to time during this conversation, but it was another torrid year when it comes to sex abuse revelations on the church, any church really. As you look back on it, what were your headlines, I wonder, from 2021?
I think the most tragic and iconic figure in 2021 was Father Alan Griffin, who was a priest from East London, had been an Anglican priest for many years, and had, in his retirement had become Roman Catholic. He took his own life at the age of 78 because he had been caught up in the cogs of the Church of England's safeguarding processes, entirely unjustly as it turned out, because he posed no kind of safeguarding risk to anybody, but the way that he was treated within the church, according to the coroner, led to his taking his own life. Now, he actually died in November 2020, but the coroner's report was published in July of this year, and it summed up really the chaos that is that's still at the centre of the church's safeguarding regimes, and that if I had to sum up what the church has been looked like this year, it's been kind of rabbit in the headlights, completely unable to grasp any kind of management of the issues around safeguarding, and increasingly there's a kind of abuse fatigue in the bigger churches that's going to lead, I think, in the next few months to some very senior resignations, very little progress, promise of various reports, promise of a redress scheme. None of that has happened. And of course, in the meantime, for those who are victims and survivors of abuse, 2021 was a deeply painful year. December was a deeply painful month. Last week was a deeply painful week. Yesterday was a deeply painful day, because while the church moves in decades, the lives of victims and survivors are measured in hours. So not terribly hopeful, I am afraid.
But when you look back at the year, I mean, there are new safeguarding people who are brought in with various organisations and the different denominations. Are you hopeful that this year saw a turning of a corner?
No,
because no,
not at all. I mean, the Church of England, for instance, is spending vastly more money than it was before, and the leadership are keen to say so. But actually, what they've created is an enormous mess at the centre, with endless deputy directors of this, that, and the other on enormous salaries. What they're not managing to do, as the media headlines will indicate, is get a grip. There's no sign of that. The heart of it, I think, is that the churches haven't grasped abuse as a theological issue, because in the end, church leaders tend to be driven by their theology, and there's huge work still to be done there.
Well, thank you. Although that is a very depressing picture.
I'm sorry.
But well, thank you again for joining us, Andrew. I'm just wondering, as we draw to a close, and we've gone on slightly longer, perhaps, are there any other things that have happened this year that anyone else would like to kind of bring up as significant events in 2021 which have shifted things?
Can I be a wee bit more hopeful to end up then?
Yes, please.
It seems to me that the further you get from power in religious organisations, the better they're doing. So at street level, many churches, for instance, are making an enormous difference in their local communities, whether it's through running food banks or shelters or taking in refugees, not only churches either by any means. So the further you get from power, the better the picture is.
And what about hopeful signs regarding race in the church? And there have been many appointments and a real practical moves forward, certainly in the Church of England, in the appointment of bishops and other senior roles. Does anyone see that as a turning point, a sign for hope? Catherine, I'm just wondering, as a church watcher, whether that fills you with any hope?
I'm sorry, Ruth, I missed that because I was so interested in what Andrew Greystone just said. I was scribbling it down. So
I was talking about signs of hope when it comes to racial equality and the positive appointments that have been made, certainly within the Church of England, in terms of bishops and other senior positions.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we think of Anglicanism as being about the Church of England, but of course it's the Anglican Communion, and it's represented across the world, and we have a considerable number of Anglicans from other parts of the world in this country. So our church, or people who are descended from those who came over. So the Church of England, one would think, will become more diverse despite its name, and that this will work its way through to the hierarchy. I'm not sure if that is happening as quickly as one might hope. Similarly, the Catholic Church, which is incredibly diverse, if you look at those in the pew, that diversity isn't so evident in its hierarchy. Apart from, of course, from the strong connections with Irish migration from years gone by, but we lack that diversity in our hierarchy at the moment.
Thank you.
But of course, there will be people who would say that diversity in the Anglican Communion is all wrapped up with colonialism, and perhaps they have a problem with it.
Well, we'll certainly be talking about that on January the 4th with the Lambeth Conference coming up next year as well. We've romped through quite a few major stories in the time available. I just would like to thank everybody for coming on the call, but also for your support and friendship during the year, and hope for more of the same next year. I hope you have a really good holiday, everybody. And if I may say, a very happy Christmas and a happy New Year to all. Take care, everyone.
Thank you all. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.